Hi there everyone, I am Zan from Fell and Fair, and on today's video on medieval and fantasy costuming, we're going to be talking about swords. This is one of the most requested videos we have. People are always asking what sort of swords we are using in our films and our photos, who makes them, why we chose to use those, all those sort of things. So hopefully those are the questions that we can address for you guys today in the video. Our couple quick disclaimers as usual. First of all, we're going to share some names and some brands and that sort of stuff. This is all stuff that we have purchased and that we use, although we have been given different pieces from different companies at different times. We try to be very authentic in our reviews and try to give good, honest opinions, but do know that we do get some stuff for free. And then second, we're not going to be talking about any strictly historical terminology or history or historically specific pieces right now. We're going to be talking in very general terms in medieval fantasy and the medieval fantasy context. So just know that if you are a reenactor or somebody that wants to get a very specific item or very specific sword, you probably need to research that item in depth. This is more an introductory overview. Hopefully it'll give you some resources to know where to go with your research from here. All right, so the first thing that people want to know when it comes to the swords that we use is, first of all, where do we get them and why do we choose to use those? So the reason that we have chosen is a big part of the design process. So let's talk about that first. Why do we use certain swords in our films and that sort of thing? Now, as people know, in a historical context, a sword is, it's a very expensive, very refined weapon. So a sword in most cases is not going to be the weapon of the peasant, of the common man. It is going to be something that is carried by the nobles and the lords and the knights. At least in basically the further back you go, the more special, for the most part, those weapons are, especially in the longer swords, like we see starting to come around in the Viking era. The other thing is, I just want to throw this out here, we're talking mostly medieval Europe, Middle Ages through the Renaissance. We're not talking ancient, we're not talking the East, Japan, China, that sort of stuff. They have their own spectacular things, but that's just not what we're talking about today. We're talking about your more traditional Western European medieval fantasy context. When it comes to what we think of the modern sword, the modern long sword, it really starts back all the way with the Vikings. They were some of the first ones. The Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons, they started kind of developing this longer sword that, instead of just being a stabbing weapon, actually had a good hewing blade that began to be produced in a more refined manner. And eventually that came to be the sword that you would actually fight other swords with, where we get the idea of a sword fight. Often a sword fight for most of history is actually one guy with a sword and shield and another guy with a sword and shield hitting each other's shields, not really hitting each other's swords as much, because swords are precious and you don't want to smash them against each other because they're also very sharp. But when we are trying to choose who has a sword in a film and then what kind of sword they use, we try to make that very historically accurate and historically inspired. So, for example, in our second Fox and the Dragon film, when you see the archers all come in, most of them have short swords, little axes, sword breakers, that sort of stuff. They're not carrying big long swords because they're commoners, while the knights are the ones that have the long swords. You'll also see that we try to choose period appropriate for the technology and the context of the film or the photo, whether that is historical or fantasy. A lot of times, and to most people, a sword is a sword is a sword is a sword, right? Most people in Hollywood, most people in their everyday lives don't understand the difference between something like a Viking longsword and a rapier or a basket hilt sword and that sort of stuff. So hopefully this will give you a little bit of terminology and kind of understand how swords developed just a little bit, so that you can do your further research in the specific areas that you want. But like I said, when we're talking medieval Europe, the first kind of sword that comes on the scene is the Viking sword. So that's something like this. You'll see it has a very wide blade with a not too fine a tip, but this is a hewing sword. So this is a sword that people are going in and they're using it like a big long axe to hack into people. Now it can stab, so it has some awesome thrusting abilities as well. And this is really good against unarmored enemies. It's lighter and faster than an axe. So you're not trying to bludgeon your enemies to death, but it is great for people that aren't wearing chainmail and that sort of stuff to cut them, although obviously you can still bludgeon someone with chainmail as well. But with chainmail armor, the point is going to be your better friend. Now, the Viking sword developed into what would later be the knights, called the long sword or the broadsword. And so that is where you see the sword develops a rounder, smaller pommel, a longer crossguard, and the blade slims down a little bit. And you get a little more length in it because the steel had gotten better, so you can make it a little longer, a little slimmer, a little lighter. So a little better for sword-on-sword combat. Let's see if I have any. And then basically at that point it becomes a split. As armor gets better and better, and as plate armor comes around, just hacking and stabbing into people isn't quite cutting it. You have to target very specific areas. So what happened is you went down to the arming sword, where you had a very small, light, nimble, thin sword that you could find the chinks into somebody's armor and kind of get in there. Or you got to the hand and a half sword, the bastard sword, where you could actually half-handed up here. You could grab the sword blade and you could use it to find the chinks in that armor and then push it in. You could also turn it around and use the crossguard as a warhammer and bash into somebody, or you hit them with a pommel. So sword fighting developed and swords developed kind of as armor developed as well. So they're constantly modifying, changing the context based on what they're trying to accomplish with that sword. Are they trying to get through chainmail armor? They're attacking unarmored foes? Are they trying to get through plate armor? All those things have affected the development of the sword. Now, when gunpowder came along and made most armor irrelevant, the key with swords was to go lighter, faster, and basically stick people with the pointy end, much as our friend Arya Stark knows. And so that's where the rapier was developed, something like this, which is long and thin and fast, because you're not trying to get through heavy armor, you just have to get through somebody's clothes and skin in order to kill them. Or something like this is a little less refined. This is a Revolutionary War period officer sword. So something like this is relatively short. So when bayonets are going forward, you're running in there. It gives you something to deal damage in the melee combat with both the edge and the point. Slightly longer and heavier for the cavalry. But this will still allow you to do damage. But once again, you're not trying to cut through armor. You're not trying to beat someone down who has plate armor. You're simply cutting at flesh and clothing. So here's another good example, interesting example. So this is a Scottish basket hilt sword. And it has the basket hilt, so this is actually a very clever innovation. So it protects the hand while you're fighting. You can see the blade actually resembles more like that medieval broadsword, that medieval longsword, which I think is actually very interesting. It was probably that way because the Scots, with their strength and ferocity, just wanted something they could really go in there and just scythe through people when they got into that melee combat. But I thought that was very interesting because people were carrying this and this at the same time. This is going to be faster. This is going to be a lot more of a butcher's weapon, as it were. Now, that's a little bit of the historical context. So when we're dealing with fantasy elements, fantasy context, we try to match up the historical to the proper fantasy. So a good example that you guys saw was in something like Lord of the Rings or even Game of Thrones for the most part. You're talking like a kind of a late Middle Ages feel for the most part. Some parts of, especially like, for example, Gondor. So the Gondorians have a more late Middle Ages feel. So they have something, their swords are closer to like Aragorn's, is closer to like a bastard sword, a hand and a half sword, or the Gondorian soldiers is closer to a late Middle Ages long sword, while the Rohirrim are closer to Viking swords because that's their armor, that's the context of their technology that they have at the time. So they did a good job kind of matching those up. So it makes sense for somebody that's kind of dressed like a Viking to carry a Viking type sword. Somebody that's more dressed like a late Middle Ages knight is going to have more of that sort of weapon. So that's a good example of matching fantasy to the appropriate historical context. Now, once we've chosen that, we have to choose what we're going to do with the sword. Is this something we're posing for a photo? Is this something we're going to be doing stunts? And is this something we're going to be doing at our live event, Weekend Warrior, where we don't actually want to injure people, but we want to be able to hit them with weapons? So we use several different types of weapons. And something else, and you'll see a lot of these things available out there on the internet, and I will say this right now, there's a lot of trash out there on the internet. A lot of people have wasted a lot of money, including myself, on really cheap swords, stainless steel and screwed together and cardboard, and they're just terrible. So hopefully this will, if you want something more than something to hang on the wall, hopefully this will give you some information about how to choose the right sword. So if we are just standing there looking heroic, we want really good sword detail, we're probably going to get something more like this. This is a real properly tempered steel blade. It's sharpened, or can be. You can see it's rusting. It's not stainless steel. It is full tang, so the blade piece goes all the way down here to the pommel, and then it's properly peened down, which is a funny word to say, but it is peened, meaning that the tang is now hammered out, so it's all one solid piece. It's not screwed on. It's not like assembled in a factory. It's some blacksmith actually went down there and finished it and said, this is good, and it's not moving, it's not going anywhere, it's staying here. That is really, I always recommend you get full tanged, and as often as you can, when you can find them, make sure that they are peened properly, because that's just going to be really key for getting a sword that sticks together if you're going to be fighting with it. So in addition to having that steel sword, we have other ones, like this is a Lord of the Rings Anduril replica. So this is a replica. It's still, I believe, a stainless blade, but it is a little more professional. It's a little better done. I guarantee you this screws on. It's definitely not peened at the end, but it's great for standing there looking heroic, looking cool, that sort of stuff. Now, you have stage combat swords. So this one is full tang and it is peened, but you can see a stainless steel blade, and it's really rounded and it's really thick. So this makes it more safe. Obviously, you still bludgeon somebody with it, but it's not going to cut anybody. The downside of this is it's really, really heavy. And so it's very hard to have accurate looking sword fights when you're waving around a very, very heavy piece of equipment like the sword. So we have found for our films and that sort of stuff, and even a lot of our photo shoots, we have our blacksmith, Charles Ellis of Eagle Crest Forge, now forges us aluminum swords. So these swords are made of aluminum. They have similar dimensions, although they are pointier, as the stage combat swords, but because they're aluminum, they're very light. So this sword weighs about the same and has the same balance as this sword, even though this one is steel and is sharp and can kill you, and this one is aluminum and dull and is less likely to kill you unless you do a really good job of being really stupid. So, like I said, these aluminum swords are great. You obviously have to have these hand forged or ground and everything by a blacksmith. So if you have a blacksmith friend, then great. If not, this may be more limited to the folks in Hollywood and the folks with professional costume design and armor and weapon studios to have access to. Now, some of the other swords that I'll show you. Here's another example of a stain. This is just a stainless steel. This is not even like a stage combat sword. This is just a stainless steel piece of something. The ball on the end here screws down and screws on, and it looks actually fine. We've used this for some different film stuff, but I wouldn't use this in a stunt. I wouldn't fight with it, and I wouldn't use it for stage combat. So this probably describes most of the swords that you'll actually find out there on the internet. Now, something we use for Weekend Warrior, the live event we have every year here in South Carolina, and you can find out about that at weekendwarriorexperience.com, is we use foam and latex swords, often called Larp swords, because they were kind of developed in the specifically for Larp events. But there's some great manufacturers out there, Mythalon, Calimacil, Epic Armory. I've got some Epic Armory and Calimacil ones here today. So this is like the Witcher sword from Calimacil. This has a great profile. It almost looks like a real sword from a distance, but it is foam, and you can chop people with it at an event, and that's pretty, it's a lot of fun. It's a great time to be able to actually hit somebody with a sword and see who would win. This is an older version Calimacil two-handed sword. This one's pretty cool, and this is a Viking sword. So you can see this is the Calimacil foam version, while this is the more historical, real version, hero version. So you can see they're very similar, but then obviously also a little bit different. But obviously I can hit somebody with this one. I really shouldn't hit someone with the other one. So anyway, Larp swords are great if you are training, if you're practicing, if you want to fight with friends, if you want to go to an event. This is a great way to have fun, and we even use them in some of our photos and stuff, because at a distance you can't tell the difference sometimes. This one is a Epic Armory one. This is their new Stronghold line, and it's actually, they're a little bulkier than Calimacil, but I gotta admit, they stand a little stiffer, but actually hurt less than some of the Calimacil. So I'm actually, like, I kind of didn't want to like it because it's got a thicker profile, but I'm actually more impressed than I thought I would be with these things. So good on the guys at Epic Armory. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about is scabbards and sheaths. Now, if you're going to buy a sword off Amazon, something like that, you're probably going to get a cheapo, basically cardboard faux leather scabbard that's all sewn together and stuff, and it's just a piece of junk. If you want a more historical type scabbard or sheath, then you're going to want something more like this. So this is wood. It's got metal fittings, brass fittings, and then it has actually a integrated sword belt. And this is something a lot of people don't realize, but most sword belts throughout history are actually integrated. The main reason being, if you want to take off your sword, all you have to do is undo your buckle. There you go, as opposed to taking your sword out of the frog, something like that. And it also just holds the sword on the belt more stably than adding a frog. We do have plenty of swords with kind of attached frogs and stuff. You can do it that way. But whenever we can, we try to have the integrated sword belts into the scabbards, into the sheaths. So this one is wood encased by leather. This one is just leather. So this is a sheath that is just leather. I know there's different definitions. People use different terms. I usually use the term scabbard if it has wood covered in leather, and then sheath if it is just leather. So I really like sheaths because we've broken almost all our scabbards because we'll do a stunt, we'll fall on them, we'll run around, we'll sit down, and then snap, and you hear that wood break, and you just go, ah. But with the leather, it just flops around, and it doesn't get in your way. It's a little harder to get them back in sometimes, but I am a big fan of just plain leather sheaths because it just works out better. It's more comfortable in the long run to have those. So this is one that we made. This is another one that we made. And like you say, you can see the belt's integrated, so you just have to wrap it around it, which can be a pain. We've got some nice historical brass, cast brass buckle here. But anyway, this is a great way, and they're also they look really cool when they're all wrapped around like this. But this is more of what a sheath or a scabbard should look like, and less like that cardboard that's been sewn together, basically, that you get from the Amazon swords. Just to note, especially, if you just want a sword, you want something to display and hang up, you don't care, that's great. But if you are costuming for a movie or a film, if you put one of those swords in the film, people will notice and it will look bad. So just know that. Fair warning, it's easy to spot those sort of sheaths and scabbards, and they look terrible. And if you want to improve and you want to get better, try to avoid having those. And that's the thing here, folks. The reason that I can tell you about all this is because I got so much of that trash, and I wasted so much money getting pieces over the years, and it took a long, long time for me to learn not only about the types of swords, but the manufacturers, the materials that could be used, how they work with each other. And so, pretty much if we buy a sword now, we buy it from our Blacksmith Charlie, that one of those aluminum ones. We don't even buy steel swords anymore for the most part, unless they're actually like prop hero swords like that Viking sword. That's a real steel sword because we want a really epic looking sword for a close-up shot for our Death of Theoden shoot. But, for a lot of these things, I would rather have a sword that works well in a fight scene and that sort of stuff, but is also safe. So aluminum is the way to go. But yeah, pay attention to the scabbard that your sword comes with, because especially if you're going for some sort of historical context, some sort of really good-looking fantasy, whether that's for a photo or a film or stage, having a good-looking sheath and scabbard can make or break a sword. Even if you have a great-looking sword, if you don't get a good sheath or scabbard, you're gonna have a bad day. Anyway, thank you so much, folks, for watching. So hopefully this has been another informative video. Please do like and comment and subscribe and do all those things. There's a bell you can press now. Do all that stuff. Come back and check back for more videos. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you guys later.